Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The rain fell gently on the roofs of Brooklyn, splashing the sidewalks with a silvery light. In a modest but warm apartment, Ethan Carter, a 16-year-old boy with a lively and determined look, watched his father, Samuel Carter, sitting in the living room, his head bowed and his hands shaking. Samuel had always been a proud, hard-working, and honest man, but today, pride alone was not enough. Ethan had just received a letter slipped under the door. His father's eviction was scheduled for the next morning. The reason given? Non-payment of rent. But Ethan knew, just like Samuel, that it was a mistake, a cruel misunderstanding perpetuated by an indifferent landlord and a ruthless administrative system. The young boy felt a dull anger rise within him, mixed with fierce determination. He silently swore that no one, not court, not lawyer, not bureaucracy, would break his father's dignity. This wasn't just a battle for an apartment, it was a battle for respect, justice, and the honor of Samuel Carter, a man who had spent his life working and sacrificing for his family. Evening was falling, and the city lights twinkled through the steamy windows. Ethan stood, gazing into the distance, aware that tomorrow he would face a courtroom full of judges, lawyers, and onlookers. But in his heart burned one certainty: he would not let injustice triumph. Tomorrow, the court would discover that a young boy could change the course of an old man's life. And that sometimes, courage doesn't wait for age. The morning dawned gray and heavy on Brooklyn, and the wind rattled the blinds of the Carters' apartment. Ethan was already up, unable to eat or think about anything else. The letter slipped under the door the day before never left his mind: eviction scheduled for tomorrow morning. Each word seemed to resonate like a hammer blow in his chest. Samuel Carter, his father, an old black man with graying hair and a face marked by life's trials, sat in his favorite armchair, looking calm but dejected. He tried to smile to reassure his son, but Ethan saw the fatigue, pain, and shame behind the mask. "Dad, how is this possible?" Ethan asked, his voice shaky but determined. "It's not your fault, Ethan," Samuel replied, his voice soft but broken. "I'll talk to the owner, but you know, sometimes people don't look beyond their own interests." Ethan felt anger rise inside him. He remembered all his father's sacrifices, years of work, rent always paid on time, nights spent saving for his son to have a better life. And now they wanted to throw him out like an intruder. He took the letter in his hands and examined every line, every detail. He quickly realized there had been an administrative error. Some payments had been misrecorded. But more than a simple error, it was the cruel indifference of the owner, Mr. Wallace, which hurt Ethan. "Dad, we can't let this go. I'm going to fight for you." Samuel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Ethan, you're young. It's dangerous, but if you think you can do it, I trust you." That conversation was the starting point. Ethan decided he was going to prepare for his fight. He had to understand the legal system, gather evidence, and most importantly, prepare to stand before a judge. Tomorrow, they would no longer be just an old man and his son facing injustice. They would become a symbol of dignity and courage. Throughout the day, Ethan pored over his father's papers, reread bank statements, and contacted neighbors and former colleagues to obtain testimony. Each piece seemed like a piece of the puzzle needed to save Samuel. And as night fell, a certainty grew within him: tomorrow, he would shake the courtroom. The pouring rain had given way to a heavy, overcast sky. Ethan Carter sat down at the small kitchen table, surrounded by piles of papers, bank statements, letters, and notebooks where his father recorded all his transactions. Each document represented potential evidence to save Samuel from deportation. He knew the court wouldn't be convinced by mere words or filial love. He had to speak with irrefutable facts, presenting each piece of evidence in a logical and compelling order. Ethan began by making a list of all the payments made, noting the exact dates and amounts, and comparing them with the reminder letters sent by the landlord. "Dad, look at this," Ethan said, showing a statement. "Here, the June payment was recorded twice, but they say you didn't pay. It's an administrative error. We can't let them get away with this. Samuel sighed but smiled proudly. You have the courage and determination to make a difference, Ethan. But remember, you must remain calm, speak respectfully and precisely. Anger never convinces a judge. Ethan nodded and spent the rest of the day drafting a battle plan. He decided to divide his presentation into several points. 1. Presentation of the facts, show that Samuel had always paid his rent. 2. Administrative errors, explain clearly the duplicates and misunderstandings. 3. Testimonies from neighbors and colleagues, provide human and credible evidence. 4. Impact of expulsion, demonstrate the unfair consequences for Samuel and his dignity. For each point, Ethan wrote clear, precise sentences, rehearsing aloud to get used to speaking in front of an audience. His mirror became his imaginary courtroom, and every word was weighed, every gesture calculated. That evening, he called a few neighbors and family friends to confirm their willingness to testify. He carefully noted their names and statements, knowing that every vote would count. Before going to bed, Ethan looked at his father sleeping in the armchair, his face peaceful but marked by worry. The young boy felt a wave of responsibility wash over him. Tomorrow, he would have to be more than a son, he would have to be the voice of justice, the weapon against the injustice that threatened Samuel. And for the first time, he understood that this fight wasn't just about saving an apartment. It was about defending dignity, honor, and truth. The next morning, Brooklyn was shrouded in a thick fog. Ethan and Samuel left their apartment, Ethan carefully carrying the file filled with meticulously organized evidence and documents. Each step brought them closer to the courtroom, but also closer to the unknown and the injustice they would face. Upon entering the building, Ethan was struck by the solemn and intimidating atmosphere. The cold stone walls, grand columns, and gleaming parquet floors seemed to absorb every breath, every whisper. The courtroom was already nearly full, with reporters and curious onlookers mingling with the parties involved. The noise of conversation faded as the clerks announced the opening of the session. The judge, Madam Lillian Hayes, a woman known for her rigor and impartiality, entered. Her penetrating gaze swept the room before settling on the parties present. The landlord's lawyers, confident and self-assured, exchanged satisfied smiles, convinced that Samuel Carter's eviction was inevitable. "Is that him? Is that really him?" whispered a journalist, pointing at Samuel, a humble old man, dressed simply but dignified. Ethan felt a lump in his throat, but he straightened and clenched his fists. He knew this was a crucial moment. He had to transform fear into strength, anger into determination. He watched his father, silent but confident in his support. "Dad, I'm ready," he said quietly. "Me too, my son. Be yourself. The truth is on our side." The court clerks called the case. The landlord and his lawyer presented their version first, presenting truncated statements and vague accusations of unpaid rent. The room listened attentively, some curious onlookers nodding in agreement, assuming that eviction would be inevitable. Ethan, however, stood ready. Every word he'd rehearsed the day before echoed in his head. Every piece of evidence he'd carefully prepared was there, in his file. He knew the slightest hesitation could jeopardize everything. But he was determined not to let injustice triumph. As silence fell over the room, Ethan stood. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Even the judge inclined his head slightly, attentive to what was to come. Tomorrow, or rather that day, Ethan was about to discover how much a voice, even a young one, could change a man's destiny. As Ethan stood before the courtroom, the silence was almost palpable. All eyes were on him, some curious, some skeptical, some even tinged with contempt. The murmurs of the lawyers and spectators had fallen silent, replaced by a silent weight weighing on his shoulders. The owner's lawyer, Mr. Richard Collins, a tall, imposing man with a condescending smile, looked at him disapprovingly. He thought he was dealing with an inexperienced kid, incapable of sustaining an argument in court. A few onlookers exchanged amused glances, wondering what a teenager could possibly say against a landlord's paperwork. Ethan felt the pressure, but it didn't paralyze him. On the contrary, it fueled his determination. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice firm and clear, echoing through the room. Your Honor, I am here to defend my father, Samuel Carter. He was always an honest and respectful tenant, but administrative errors led to this unjust eviction. I will show you, with supporting evidence, that my father always paid his rent on time. The murmur in the room intensified. Some spectators exchanged surprised whispers. The owner's lawyer frowned, visibly irritated by the young boy's courage and clarity. Are you sure a teenager can actually present these documents correctly? Whispered a spectator behind Ethan. But Ethan wasn't distracted. He unfurled his statements, letters, and notebooks, presenting each piece with logic and precision. Every document he held up contradicted the accusations, and every argument he put forward was constructed to demonstrate the truth. The disapproving looks began to change. Judge Hayes frowned slightly, clearly paying attention to the clarity and precision of her words. Even Mr. Collins began to show signs of concern, realizing that this young man wasn't just prepared, he was fearsomely effective. Ethan felt a surge of confidence wash over him. The room that had deemed him too young, too fragile, too inexperienced was beginning to realize he possessed extraordinary strength and insight. The skeptical looks were slowly turning to astonishment. And in that tense silence, Ethan understood that this was no longer just a battle to save his father's apartment. It was a battle for justice, truth, and dignity. The silence in the courtroom was almost suffocating. Everyone present held their breath, aware that something unusual was happening. Ethan Carter, the 16-year-old boy, stood straight, his eyes fixed on the judge, his clear, steady voice beginning to resonate. Your Honor, I am here to defend my father, Samuel Carter. This is not a case of willful non-payment, but an administrative error that we can prove with documents and testimony. My father was always an honest and respectful man. Ethan then held up the first bank statement. Every figure was correct, every date carefully checked. He pointed out the double payments, the reminder letters sent without justification, and explained how these errors had led to an unjust charge. Murmurs began to spread through the room. The previously skeptical audience was now listening attentively, captivated by the boy's precision and courage. Even the owner's lawyer, Richard Collins, frowned, sensing the strength of the arguments just presented to him. We also contacted my father's neighbors and former colleagues, who can attest to his loyalty and diligence. Their words, as well as these documents, prove that my father does not deserve this expulsion. Ethan gestured to a neighbor in the room, Mrs. Angela Thompson, who stood up and calmly confirmed the boy's words. Other witnesses then came forward to corroborate the story, each reinforcing the credibility of the documents presented. As Ethan's voice rose, so did his confidence. Every word seemed to strike directly at the heart of the courtroom, every piece of evidence reinforcing the apparent injustice of the landlord's case. The judge, Mrs. Hayes, listened attentively, taking notes and occasionally nodding, visibly impressed by the young boy's poise and clarity. Even the previously indifferent audience now felt the magnitude of the truth. Disapproving looks turned to astonishment and silent respect. Ethan, aware of the effect he was having on the room, continued. Your Honor, what you see here is not just a paperwork error. It is a matter of dignity and justice. My father deserves recognition for his efforts and loyalty. At that moment, the court seemed suspended. Ethan's words had pierced the wall of skepticism and indifference. His voice, firm but sincere, became a symbol of truth, courage, and justice. And in this silence charged with emotion, everyone understood that this young boy had just transformed an administrative matter into a moral fight, capturing the attention and respect of everyone. Ethan knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to show, prove, let the facts speak for themselves. With an almost preternatural calm for his age, he opened his file and began presenting each piece with surgical precision. Your Honor, here are my father's bank statements for the past 6 months. Every payment was made on time and correctly. He handed the first statement to the judge, Madam Hayes, who examined it carefully. Then, one by one, he showed the duplicate payments, the erroneous reminder letters, and the administrative errors that had led to the unjust expulsion. Each document was clear, concise, and irrefutable. As you can see, these mistakes are not the result of any failure on the part of my father, but of poor management by the owner. Then Ethan signaled to his witnesses. Mrs. Angela Thompson, a faithful neighbor for more than 20 years, stood up. Samuel Carter has always paid his rent. He is respectful and honest. This eviction is unfair. Then a former colleague of Samuel, Mr. David Reynolds, confirmed Ethan's words. I worked with Samuel for 15 years. He never failed in his responsibilities. If an administrative error occurred, it was certainly not his fault. Each testimony strengthened the case. Ethan let them speak, carefully noting their words and actions, knowing that the force of their truth would outweigh any legal argument. The audience, initially skeptical, now watched in awe. Even the owner's lawyer, Mr. Collins, seemed unsettled. His notes were hastily scribbled, desperately searching for an angle to counter this relentless demonstration. Ethan, noticing the effect of his evidence, concluded with a voice full of conviction. Your Honor, these documents and testimony clearly show that my father is the victim of a mistake, not a failure. He deserves justice. And I ask you to recognize this truth before he is unjustly deported. Silence fell over the room. Everyone felt the weight of the truth, the blatant injustice that was about to be corrected. Even the normally impassive judge seemed moved by the young boy's confidence and integrity. At that moment, Ethan understood that this was no longer just a legal battle, it was a triumph of truth over injustice, and nothing could now stop the force of his irrefutable evidence. The silence in the courtroom was almost surreal. Even the sound of pencils on paper seemed to disappear. Every spectator, every reporter, every lawyer held their breath. Ethan Carter had just finished presenting his evidence, and the effect was immediate. The entire courtroom was in shock. The face of Mr. Richard Collins, the owner's lawyer, was pale. He had underestimated this boy, thinking he could hold his own against an inexperienced teenager. But now he understood that this young boy had turned the tables with a logic and precision that no superficial legal argument could counter. Madam Justice Lillian Hayes, usually impassive, frowned and pored over her notes. The documents were impeccable, the testimonies consistent, irrefutable. She knew that a hasty decision risked sealing an injustice that would have come to light. Very well, she murmured to herself, her voice measured but firm. I will take a moment to review all the documents and testimony before making my decision. The courtroom held its breath as she withdrew to study the exhibits. The murmurs resumed, but this time they were tinged with awe and surprise. The spectators whispered among themselves, "This is incredible, this boy has really turned the tide." Ethan felt his heart pound, but he stood tall and calm. He had done all he could, the truth was exposed, and justice would follow. His father, Samuel, placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes full of pride and emotion. "Ethan, you did what I never thought possible," Samuel whispered. "Dad, you're the one who taught me to never give in to injustice. Today, you're the one who was protected by that lesson," Ethan replied with a slight smile. During those few minutes of withdrawal, the courtroom seemed suspended in time. The spectators, and even the owner's lawyer, knew that what they had just witnessed was not just a legal argument, it was a demonstration of courage, determination, and truth. When the judge finally returned, all eyes turned to her. The air, thick with tension, seemed ready to explode. Everyone knew that the moment of truth had arrived, and that what this room was about to hear would forever change the perception of injustice in this case. The court was plunged into an almost religious silence. Every gaze was fixed on Madam Justice Lillian Hayes, who was about to pronounce the decision that would change Samuel Carter's life. Ethan, his heart pounding, felt his hands grow sweaty, but he stood straight, his gaze fixed on his father. Samuel, despite his age and fatigue, maintained a proud and dignified expression. The judge took a deep breath and began to speak. After carefully reviewing all the documents, records, and testimony presented in this case, it is clear that the expulsion of Mr. Samuel Carter was based on administrative errors and not on any failure on his part. A murmur ran through the room, mixing surprise and admiration. The journalists' faces betrayed their astonishment, while the spectators held their breath. "Therefore, I decide to cancel this eviction." The owner will have to rectify his mistakes and acknowledge the payment made by Mr. Carter. The silence was suddenly broken by a mixture of exclamations and sighs of relief. Samuel Carter let out a small, stifled laugh, unable to hold back his tears. He stood up and took Ethan in his arms, squeezing him with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "My son, you saved not only our home, but also my dignity," Samuel whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "You taught me to fight for what's right, Dad. Today, we're protecting you," Ethan replied, his eyes shining. Even the owner's lawyer, Mr. Collins, stood frozen, unable to hide his astonishment and frustration. He had underestimated the power of truth and the courage of a determined teenager. Inside the room, witnesses and neighbors applauded softly, while some journalists frantically took notes, aware that they had just witnessed an extraordinary scene. Young Ethan Carter had transformed a legal case into a resounding demonstration of justice, courage, and determination. For Samuel and Ethan, it wasn't just a victory over expulsion, it was a victory over injustice and fear, a reminder that truth, backed by courage, could triumph over any obstacle. As they left the courtroom, the air was thick with palpable emotion. Passers-by, witnesses to the hearing, approached to congratulate Ethan and Samuel. Journalists surrounded the duo, their cameras capturing every moment of this historic moment. Ethan, though young, stood tall and calm, aware that his courage had just inspired more than just his father. "Mr. Carter, young man, it's incredible what you've accomplished today," exclaimed a reporter, holding out a microphone. "Thank you," Ethan replied humbly. "I only stood up for what was right. My father deserves this justice." Neighbors and friends who had supported Samuel for years gathered to offer their congratulations and hugs. Mrs. Angela Thompson, the faithful neighbor, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You have shown everyone what courage and determination mean. You have made your father, and the entire community, proud today." Samuel, his eyes shining with tears of gratitude and pride, spoke. "Ethan, you not only saved our home, but you also reminded everyone that truth and justice must always prevail. You are an exceptional boy, and I am honored to be your father." On the street, passers-by whispered among themselves, recounting the young boy's bravery and how he had turned the tide of the court with his evidence and eloquence. The story spread quickly, inspiring other young people and adults to believe that determination could change the most unlikely injustices. Ethan looked at his father and felt an immense pride fill him. This was no longer just a fight for an apartment, it was a triumph of dignity, justice, and family love. The people around them applauded not just for Samuel and Ethan, but for the symbol they represented, that an act of courage and truth could bring about real and immediate change. As the sun began to break through the clouds, Ethan and Samuel left the courthouse hand in hand, knowing that this day would remain etched in their memory and in the memories of all who had witnessed this unique moment. The days following the verdict were filled with a sense of renewal and hope for the Carters. Samuel returned to his apartment with a newfound serenity, accompanied by his son Ethan, whose courage and determination had saved the family. Every room in the apartment seemed brighter, as if justice had breathed new life into their walls. Ethan spent time organizing his father's papers and documents, this time with a smile, knowing that everything was now in order. He felt immense pride, but also a responsibility, to continue to defend truth and justice in all situations of his life. "Dad, look, everything is finally in its place," Ethan said, closing the binder. "Yes, my son," Samuel replied, his voice full of tenderness. "And it's all thanks to you. You reminded me what it means to be courageous and just." Neighbors came to visit, bringing cakes, flowers, and messages of support. The entire community seemed to have been touched by the story of this boy and his father. Journalists continued to write about their victory, recounting how a young teenager had defied the court and exposed the truth with extraordinary maturity and wisdom. But more than the accolades or public recognition, it was Samuel and Ethan's relationship that had changed. The experience had strengthened their bond, and each knew they could count on the other in the face of injustice and hardship. As they walked side by side through the neighborhood, Ethan and Samuel noticed the smiling faces of their neighbors and the silent respect of passers-by. They understood that this victory extended beyond their family, it had inspired a lesson of courage and dignity in all who had followed it. Samuel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Ethan, no matter what life throws at us, today you taught me one essential thing: truth and justice always triumph when we dare to stand up for them." "I only followed your example, Dad." "You taught me to never give in to injustice," Ethan replied with a bright smile. And so, the Carter family began a new chapter in their lives. More united, stronger, and more confident in the power of justice and courage. That day, they realized that even in the face of the most daunting obstacles, truth, backed by courage and determination, could change the course of events and offer a future full of hope. The sun rose over Brooklyn, illuminating their apartment and their hearts, symbolizing a new beginning, filled with dignity, respect, and newfound pride.